So welcome. This is two Wordsmiths and a Wolfhound, and the Wolfhound was here not too long ago. Maybe she'll come back. So Chris, what are we drinking tonight?
We have a wonderful sweet red wine for some sweet authors and a sweet dog.
Yes, hopefully you'll see the sweet dog tonight. That is very good. What is the Sterling Castle? And I believe we got that up around Castle Danger, didn't we?
We did indeed,
Minnesota.
on the North Shore of Minnesota.
Yeah, so the book we're going to review tonight is called The Evidential Power of Beauty, and the subtitle is Science and Theology Meet. It is by Father Thomas Dubay, and he was born in 1921, lived until 2010. He was born in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and he was one of 7 children. So, Chris, why did you pick this book tonight?
Well, in some of our research that we're doing that integrates music with science, theology, and other topics such as philosophy and culture, it seemed apparent that the idea of looking at music and art and trying to understand what is really foundational to it and how does it connect us to God became very important. And this book then came immediately across our radar when we happened to visit a small bookstore in Stillwater, Minnesota. And I ended up with this very, very dog-eared version of this book.
And I believe I have a fresh, clean copy because I read books by handing them to you and saying, what was it about?
Indeed.
Not always, but sometimes.
And so then I happened to find a very, very excellent book by a wonderful author who's written a number of books that are actually in our library. But in this book, he talks about how beauty is foundational to what God actually is and what our relationship to God can be through beauty as well.
So what does this book do? How do science and theology meet? To most people, that's a contradiction in terms these days.
Yes,
but that's a major point of his book, is that they really do meet and they work together.
Yes, and so, you would start to ask, what do people like Lewis Thomas, who's a biochemist, Albert Einstein is a physicist, and Richard Feynman as a physicist have in common? And Richard Feynman was quoted once as saying, you can recognize truth by its beauty and simplicity. In other words, scientific truth is a fundamentally beautiful truth. And then Robert Ogros and George Stachio, who are both physicists, said that all the most important physicists of the 20th century agree that beauty is the primary standard for scientific truth. And you start to then wonder, well, what is the connection with theology? And science writer Sharon Begley, when she was kind of reviewing and admiring the results from the Hubble Space Telescope, spoke to the idea of this, saying that this speaks to a question so basic that they begin in theology and only in this century became the province of science. So the idea here is that the transcendental nature of what becomes beautiful is something that goes back thousands of years. And it's only very recently that we've just said what is scientific about the world is only the province of science versus theology as well.
I want to back up to this idea that what is beautiful is scientifically correct. Is that the way you phrased it?
Pretty much, yes.
Okay. There is a fascinating study, and I don't remember the name of the scientist offhand, but he studied if you take a glass of water and you have a group of people think positive, loving, warm thoughts at one glass of water, and you have another glass of water and a bunch of people saying negative thoughts like, I hate you, you're terrible, you're ugly, and then you let the water freeze and you examine the ice crystals, there's a phenomenal, striking difference. And the ones that have the loving thoughts aimed at them and the kind and the nice thoughts have these beautiful shapes, and they're symmetric and they're snowy and they're lacy. And the ones that have the ugly thoughts, they actually look like these ugly cancerous cells. And so I think that's a hard concept for most people to understand, how beauty somehow proves science. But I think that's an example of where it probably does.
Yes, very much so. That speaks actually directly to the idea that Dubay brings up that he calls convergence, the idea that the God of revelation and theology is the same as the God of nature and the cosmos.
Now, Dubay speaks of a thirst for beauty. What does that mean?
The basic idea is, from his perspective, coming from the Society of Mary, he sees this thirst for heaven, this thirst for God, this thirst for beauty. And the idea then is, what does that really mean? Well, it manifests itself in a total of 5 ways, in that we have wonder, we would pursue wonder in the world, that we have delight about what's in the world. And in fact, from 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 8, it's a joy so glorious it cannot be described. That's the type of delight that God looks for us in his world. That we also search for personal enrichment. The idea is that we have an enlightened appreciation for nature, a deepening contemplative prayer life, and an immersion in authentic liturgical worship. This gives us the ability to appreciate exactly what's going on in the world as recognizing that it comes from God. We also have in the 4th item, pursuing and finding truth and appreciating where that truth comes from. It comes from God. And this idea, and I find this most fascinating, of a genuine falling in love. The idea that this is a selfless commitment to a fascinating beloved. And we know of 2 main examples of that within the church. One is marriage to a man or woman, and the other is marriage to God through what priests or what saints do by being so devoted to God. And I find that to be very illustrative of what this idea of participating in beauty really means.
So how does Dubay unpack and work through this concept of beauty?
Well, he does it in a couple of interesting ways. One is just to appreciate beauty for what it is, and also ugliness for what it is. In fact, he quotes the brothers Karamazov from Fyodor Dostoevsky, saying that beauty is the battlefield where God and Satan contend with each other for the hearts of men. And in popular culture, we see this in the song from Krista Berg called Spanish Train.
Yes, that's a fantastic song.
Yes. But he explores beauty at a whole bunch of different levels. The idea of beauty beckoning us, the radiant form of beauty, us being alive to beauty, the idea then of ugliness as well, and how much of that is in our worlds today. Then the idea of what convincing power is. In other words, the evidential power that points to truth and connects beauty to God. He then works through a number of what he calls macro marvels, midi marvels, and mini marvels. So literally taking and looking at beauty from the standpoint of the entire universe, plants and animals in our daily lives, and then atoms and cells, and how we can find beauty at every level of that. He looks at artistry and design. And by this, I mean the design of the universe, the idea that there's planning, design, and art found in nature. And he connects that directly to God. He then looks at this from the standpoint of the crown of the cosmos. And you might first think that the crown of the cosmos is God, but what he means is actually God's creation of us in his world. We are the crowning achievement of the cosmos in that. And then the beauty of sanctity, the idea of supernatural beauty. So what is the beauty of our soul, our heroic virtue, our selfless love, our beauty that we find in music. And then the idea of the splendor of revelation. In other words, the word that God gave us, both as biblical truth and then also as logos, in other words, Christ. And the idea here is that we then proceed to the glory supreme, the idea of Trinitarian beauty or the glory of the Lord, and then the afterglow. And the afterglow is kind of his most interesting chapter because we've been now looking at the lofty idea of beauty from so many angles. And he says, we have a daily nitty-gritty of our lives. Now, how do you find beauty? Well, you see it in this idea of life within the glow of the beautiful.
That's a lot to take in. And as you were talking, I was thinking about some of the research that I've done that talks about how every culture has tonality to their music. And that goes back to this idea of how science and beauty and theology all connect, that we seem to be born with this inherent feel for tonal music as opposed to atonal, which I found very fascinating. I just stumbled across that. Now, what makes Dubay's points about beauty science and theology valid? I mean, why is this not just him talking off the top of his head?
Yes, he speaks to 6 basic criteria of validity. One is that it's divinely authoritative and a historically solid foundation. One is that there's a complete satisfaction of the noblest human needs, desires, and aspirations. The third is that there's celestial and radiant beauty, far surpassing the best of merely human ideas and projects. The fourth aspect of validity is that there's an intellectually sound coherence that no other outlook can match. The fifth is the transforming impact and power of the message itself. It makes saints of heroic goodness. And then the sixth is the founder and exemplar of the matchless state of Jesus Christ. And what he says is, what Father Dubay says is, only the biblical view, which is a Christ-centered view of the world, speaks to all 6 of these validity criteria, and how that so connects beauty in such a powerful and evidential way to God.
What I find fascinating about this book is I think that most people don't really think of beauty. We don't think that it's important. You know, we think it's very subjective. And I think he gets a bit into how it's not necessarily as subjective as we think it is.
Right. There is an objective concept of
Mhm.
beauty, and it comes from God himself. He made the world deliberately to be a beautiful place. He made us with the ability to appreciate that beauty and participate in it.
Right.
We are not independent of
And
God
that
in
goes
that
back
way.
even to things like when you study under microscope
Mhm.
DNA or cells, there is a certain beauty and symmetry to
Absolutely.
all sorts of biological creations. So, but let's put this on a practical scale. What do we do day to day to do with beauty, what God wants us to do? How does this really impact our daily lives, these very profound concepts he's talking about?
I think there's 2 main aspects that I was able to glean from the book. One, and I think this is one of his most important concepts, is does what you're doing on a day-to-day basis, is what you're looking at, is what you're participating in the world, does it take you closer to God every day, or does it take you farther away? That kind of criterion and kind of looking at the world from that standpoint can do an awful lot towards taking you closer to God. When we appreciate that the ugliness of the world, and especially if we're participating in that ugliness, only isolates ourselves from God, God does not isolate himself from us, then the idea is why are we paying attention to such things, such forces, such ugliness, as he writes a chapter about in this book? We don't need to. We certainly, it takes us away from our relationship from God, but it fundamentally will be only a frustrating experience from that regard. There's so much beautiful in the world. Why would we waste our time only hiding behind the ugly in this world? The second aspect, I think, that really comes into this is the idea that you recognize that prayer is all around you. When you recognize the beauty of God's world and you thank him for that beauty, and you just appreciate that what has been created in this universe, in this world, is of God, you are praying. You are praying a prayer of thanksgiving and of participation in his world. And that's exactly the type of dialogue that God wants us to have on a daily basis with him, that it's continuous, and that we treat God as beloved the way he looks at us as beloved, and we love him for the beauty of this world.
That's a very profound answer, a very deep answer. Part of what I would say is, I think just when we look at something beautiful, you know, if we look out, for instance, we're looking out right now at the snow coming down outside our windows, and it's landing on the trees, and it's beautiful, and it sort of lifts your heart in a way that if you look out, you know, your window looks out into the alley with the dumpster, I find it hard to believe that anybody is going to look out on that and go, oh, wow, I feel good.
That brings up a very good point in that we have created many aspects of our world that are inherently not pretty,
Mhm.
and yet we subject ourselves to them. And sometimes even just recognizing that you live immersed in ugliness
Mhm.
is the first step towards transcending it.
Right.
I think also many people can't necessarily escape that, but there are many beautiful aspects to even our day-to-day lives when we're immersed in such ugliness. The love a mother has for her child,
Mhm.
even a small park that we can go to and just see a flower growing,
Yep.
or looking up at the sky and seeing that it's beautiful, that the
Right.
sunrise is wonderful today, or the music that you might hear.
Mhm.
There are, God again has created a fundamentally beautiful world, and despite man's best attempt at trying to make it
Right.
ugly in many ways, we do have the power to appreciate
Right.
how much we are
And I
immersed in
think
that.
that's sort of the two edges of the sword, is that beauty, when we see it, we instinctively know it. It lifts our hearts and souls. And yet, even if we're in a place that is not naturally beautiful, we can still look to the sky, to the stars, to the sunrise. We can put something on our wall that makes us happy. That's beautiful. If it's your child's drawing, that makes your heart lift. So I hold up the book again. This is a thick book,
Yes,
and
indeed.
as you can tell, there are a lot of pages to it. And from our conversation, you can tell it's a pretty heavy reading, pretty heavy concepts. What would be the incentive for the average person to pick up a book like this and try and wade through it a little bit? How would it make their lives better? How would it make society better?
That's a very good question. And I think there's a couple of aspects. One is to see that there is an iron triangle that God has created that balances science, theology, and beauty. And that beauty is fundamentally the connector of all things in this universe. And to see how Father Dubay systematically works through so many aspects of our lives in order to demonstrate not just the power of beauty in our world, but in fact, the truth that God has brought to us through himself and his world as a function of beauty. And then to realize that all aspects of ourselves, all of our senses, and our appreciation in our minds is able to be centered on what God has wrought in this world, and to see it as beautiful, whether we are a scientist, whether we are a laborer, whether we are a priest, that we all have this power to understand that God is truly at the center. And so to see this comprehensive treatment of how, as we talked about in the beginning, that subjects such as science and theology certainly seem distant from one another, let alone both connected through beauty, I think is a very, very powerful reason to spend time writing, or excuse me, reading this book. It's also very interesting from the standpoint that Father Dubay is a fantastic writer of theology, and he's a compelling writer. He's powerful, and yet it is not what you would call dripping with theology from a standpoint of being so complex it's impenetrable. He's an engaging writer from that standpoint, so it's a fascinating read.
And he has a few other books, doesn't he?
Yes,
I think he was a fairly prolific writer.
yes, he has a number of books on saints, a number of books on prayer, just up and down. So you can get very deeply theological and Catholic with him, or I think in this book you can still be quite Catholic, but also have a message that is compelling to anyone of almost any stripe.
Almost any faith. And I agree with that because, as I said at the beginning, I think people think that faith and theology are sort of diametric opposites in the world we live in today. And this is a book that it doesn't matter if you're Catholic. I don't think it even matters if you're Christian. He's drawing together these ideas that show that maybe faith and theology aren't so far apart. And in fact, it harkens back to the fact that some of the very earliest scientists were, I believe, in Catholic priests, not merely Christians, but Catholic priests.
Yes, by many aspects that was the case. In fact, The Industrial Revolution should have started in the 16th century because a Catholic priest invented the Bessemer process for how to process iron ore. Because of repression of that church at the time, these priests were not able to bring out their Bessemer method, and you didn't see it really arise until the late 18th and early 19th centuries in the Industrial Revolution. Well, we've seen this many times as Catholic priests through history, such as the warrior monks in Ireland, protected Western thought from dismantling by many barbarian raids at that time. And so, we see how when you systematically pursue knowledge from a very well-rounded, or in a philosophical sense, we call it a hermeneutic perspective, it becomes very rich and very powerful in terms of its ability to help us in our day-to-day lives, as well as predict what will happen if you don't necessarily align yourself with goodness and beauty in this world.
Right. And I think, in fact, many of these early Catholic priests were motivated to study science, to learn more about the world, because they believed that to understand the world God created would help us to understand God himself. And so science, in many ways, really did arise from the desire to understand God, which is what makes it very interesting how we've gone from that to the world today that thinks they're opposites.
Yes, absolutely. I agree.
So yeah, it's I have to admit I haven't waded through it, partly because I'm always working, but it's a very fascinating book and some ideas that we're not typically exposed to today. So I think it's well worth reading, and I look forward to the day I can. And what do you think the chances are we can get the Wolfhound part of the two Wordsmiths and the Wolfhound over here?
Well, she's collapsed on the floor, but we'll see. Lead in.
Lead in, come here. She was being a complete camera hog before we started.
She was video bombing.
Sweetheart. Come here. There she is.
There's our
Let's
wonderful
see.
Wolfhound.
Can we get her to look and smile at the camera? Not
Lead in.
quite. Not quite. Next time we'll hold a treat up there. But
Yes, indeed.
She would definitely
dog.
say hi if she spoke English.
And
Yeah.
an example of something beautiful in God's world.
Let's see if we can get her farther over.
Can you
Yep,
lead
her
us?
little calic is standing up there.
Yes. And yes, there's a wonderful pooch. She has very beautiful eyes, if you could see them.
So, Slancha to Father Dubay.